30 seconds, a foreign leader used one word to leave the most powerful office on earth without an answer. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a precise description of what happened when the President of the United States stood at the White House podium, surrounded by the flags of both nations, in front of the International Press Corps, and called the Prime Minister of Canada a liar. Not in a private conversation, not in a leaked memo, not in an off-the-cuff remark at a campaign rally. He did it 5 times in a single formal statement in the White House briefing room during what the official schedule had listed as a routine economic update. And within 30 seconds, the man he accused had walked to a podium in Ottawa, held up one sheet of paper, and, using 5 words, handed the most analyzed diplomatic exchange in recent memory back to Washington, with the direction of the accusation permanently reversed. Let me explain what actually happened, because the sequence of events matters as much as the words themselves. The presidential address had been underway for nearly an hour. The International Press Corps was in attendance in full. Cameras were rolling across every major network. Notebooks were open. Producers were stationed at their monitors. The afternoon had the quiet, procedural rhythm of a standard Washington briefing, the kind that fills 90 seconds of the nightly news and is forgotten by morning. Then the president departed from every norm that has governed Western diplomatic communication since the end of the Second World War. He did not express frustration. He did not signal displeasure through carefully chosen language. He did not allow a momentary irritation to color an otherwise measured statement. He looked directly into the live camera, surrounded by those flags and those journalists, and he called the Prime Minister of Canada a liar.
5 times, each repetition landing with the same blunt, unqualified force. He accused Mark Carney of lying about trade numbers, about the bilateral deficit, about what America had contributed to the relationship, and about which country actually needed the other more. There was no diplomatic softening. There was no private channel through which frustration had first been expressed. This was the formal, on-the-record, publicly broadcast position of the President of the United States toward the elected leader of the country's closest ally and largest trading partner.
The room went still in the way that rooms go still when something genuinely unprecedented has just occurred. Not the performed stillness of manufactured drama, but the involuntary pause of people processing the fact that a line has just been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Let me explain why that line mattered so specifically, because the content of the accusation is the key to understanding everything that followed. The president did not accuse Carney of a policy disagreement. He did not accuse him of negotiating in bad faith or of pursuing Canadian interests too aggressively. The accusation was precise, that Carney had lied about the trade data, that the figures Carney had cited in previous public statements, figures about the goods balance, the services balance, energy integration, and the architecture of the bilateral supply chain, were fabricated. That Carney had manufactured or distorted economic statistics to make Canada's position appear stronger than reality supported. That was the charge. Lying about numbers, inventing data. That was what the President of the United States said 5 times at the White House podium on camera to the world. Here is what the data actually showed. The figures that Mark Carney had cited in his public statements came from 3 sources: the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, the United States International Trade Commission, the United States Department of Commerce. Not Canadian government agencies, not independent research institutions with a political orientation, not academic estimates subject to methodological dispute. The official, published, taxpayer-funded statistical output of the United States federal government. Carney had not exaggerated these numbers.
He had not selectively presented them. He had not run them through a favorable interpretive framework. He had quoted the president's own government back to the president, and for doing so, he had been called a liar 5 times in front of every camera on Earth.
The diplomatic community reacted with a velocity and a severity that signaled something beyond routine concern. Former ambassadors used phrases like unprecedented in the post-war era Allied governments issued statements that, translated from the careful language of diplomacy into plain English, said that a line had been crossed that no Western leader had crossed in living memory. France expressed grave concern. Germany called the language beneath the standards of the alliance. Japan issued what analysts described as its strongest rebuke directed at a sitting American president since the formal end of the Second World War. And the concern was not purely about Canada. It was about architecture.
It was about the invisible framework of assumed good faith that makes diplomatic relationships between allies functional, the understanding that disagreements are about interests, about policy, about strategy, but not about the personal integrity of elected leaders. That framework had not been strained. It had been publicly demolished in a single briefing.
What would stop the same accusation from being directed at the Chancellor of Germany, at the Prime Minister of Japan, at any Allied leader who cited data that contradicted a preferred political narrative? That was the question that moved through foreign ministries on 4 continents in the hours after the briefing ended. And then the world waited for Carney's response. Let me explain what the world expected, because the gap between expectation and reality is where the story becomes something more than a diplomatic incident. The unanimous expectation among political analysts, diplomatic correspondents, veteran communications professionals, and foreign policy commentators was a substantial response. A press conference, charts, source documents displayed on screens, a panel of economists and former trade officials, a forensic, point-by-point dismantling of every element of the accusation, with every citation verified and every figure traced to its origin. Some predicted economic retaliation, tariff responses, the suspension of bilateral working groups, the recall of senior diplomatic staff. The consensus was that the severity of a sitting president publicly calling a foreign leader a liar 5 times on camera demanded a proportional response. And proportional, by every conventional measure, meant extensive. Proportional meant long. Proportional meant visible. Nobody predicted 30 seconds. Nobody predicted a single sheet of paper on a simple podium in Ottawa. No visual aids, no expert witnesses, no machinery of modern political communication deployed in any recognizable form. But behind the scenes, Carney's communications team had in fact prepared exactly what the world expected. 15 minutes of sourced, verified, methodically constructed argument, complete with supporting documentation drawn from multiple government agencies. Airtight, correct, thorough. By any conventional standard, an effective response. Carney read it in full, set it down, and according to multiple people present in the room, said something that has since become the central observation of this entire episode. If I need 15 minutes to prove I am not a liar, I have already lost. The truth does not need 15 minutes. Give me 30 seconds. His staff argued against it. They warned that brevity would be read as having nothing to say. They said the global audience expected a demonstration of evidentiary weight, a show of documented force. Carney listened. He nodded. He repeated, 30 seconds. And then he walked to the podium. Let me explain what happened in those 30 seconds, because each element of the response was structurally precise in a way that becomes clearer the more carefully it is examined. The room in Ottawa was full. Every major Canadian outlet was present. International correspondents had filled every available seat. The feed was live in every major newsroom on the planet. Carney stepped up alone, one sheet of paper in his hand. No dramatic rearrangement of the flags, no altered lighting, no music. Just a man, a piece of paper, and a camera carrying his image to every screen on Earth. He began by doing something that most communications professionals would advise against under these circumstances. He repeated the accusation in his own voice. The President of the United States called me a liar today. Then, 2 seconds of complete silence. He did not look away from the camera. He did not adjust his notes. He let the words sit in the air, but now under his control, placed on his terms, stripped of the president's framing and redeployed in a context he owned entirely. Then he said that my statements about the bilateral trade balance were lies, specifically that the figures I cited on goods, services, energy, and supply chain integration were fabricated. He held up the single sheet of paper. This is the relevant data from the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, the United States International Trade Commission, and the United States Department of Commerce, all published within the last 90 days. It confirms, on every metric I cited, exactly what I said. Then he lowered the paper, and without raising his voice, without changing his expression, without a single theatrical gesture, he delivered the sequence that has since been replayed thousands of times across every platform on Earth. So either the president did not read his own government's data before calling me a liar. 1 second of silence. Or he did read it and called me a liar anyway. 2 seconds of silence. He let that binary land without assistance. There was no third door. The audience's mind had exactly 2 options, and both led to the same conclusion: ignorance or dishonesty. There was no escape route built into the structure of those 2 sentences, and Carney had not built one in. Then he looked directly into the camera and said 5 words. The word he is looking for is mirror. He closed the folder. He nodded once. He stepped back from the podium. He left the room. 30 seconds had elapsed. Let me explain why 30 seconds was not merely sufficient, but was the only duration that could have achieved what it achieved. The silence after Carney walked away lasted 4 full seconds before the room erupted. Journalists reaching for phones, producers shouting into headsets, the unmistakable sound of a story breaking in real time. Within 15 minutes, the clip was airing in full on every major network. Nothing needed to be cut. Nothing needed to be explained. The response was its own context. Within an hour, the word mirror was trending across every major platform globally. Within 3 hours, it had been translated into 46 languages and shared hundreds of millions of times. The word had entered the political vocabulary of the planet faster than any diplomatic statement in the history of modern media. And the reason it worked, the reason 30 seconds defeated what could have been a 15-minute rebuttal, is encoded in the architecture of those 30 seconds. The repetition of the accusation in Carney's own voice took ownership of the moment. He did not flinch from the word liar. He placed it on his own terms, in his own context, before any rebuttal had been offered. The single sheet of paper was not merely a visual aid, it was a signal. The evidence was so clear, so simple, so direct, that it required no binder, no stack of documents, no team of supporting experts. 1 page, from the president's own government. The binary construction gave every person watching exactly 2 conclusions, with no third option available, and neither conclusion was favorable to the man who had spoken first.
Pause. And the mirror line delivered the final movement. Not a counterattack, not a return insult, but a redirection. A statement that the word the president had deployed, liar, applied to the person who had used it, not to the person it had been aimed at. Look in the mirror. You will find what you are describing.
Let me explain the response from Washington, because the institutional reaction in the days that followed is as revealing as the 30 seconds themselves. The White House press secretary held a briefing 2 hours after the clip aired. She was immediately asked the question that Carney's binary had made structurally unavoidable. The Prime Minister cited data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, and the Department of Commerce. Does the president dispute his own government's data? There was no safe answer to that question. There had never been a safe answer to that question.
Answering yes would mean publicly acknowledging that the president was contradicting the official statistical output of his own administration's agencies, an admission of internal institutional chaos. Answering no would mean acknowledging that the data was accurate, and therefore that the president had called a foreign leader a liar for accurately stating verified facts produced by the United States government. The press secretary could not navigate the trap because the trap had no navigable exit. The resulting footage, a senior White House official visibly unable to answer a direct yes or no question, was clipped and shared nearly as widely as Carney's original 30 seconds.
One veteran White House correspondent said on air in the days that followed that in 4 administrations he had never witnessed a foreign leader neutralize a presidential attack so completely, so quickly, and with so few words. Republican strategists, speaking privately, acknowledged the structural problem immediately. The administration had been outmaneuvered by a 30-second clip using its own government's data. A long response draws attention back to the original exchange and looks defensive. A short response accomplishes nothing. Ignoring it entirely concedes the point without contest. Carney had constructed a response with no winning countermove, and he had done it in less time than a television advertisement. Senators from both parties were notably restrained in their public comments, a silence that political analysts interpreted as neither side wishing to draw additional attention to a clip that presented a foreign leader demonstrating, in 30 seconds, with one piece of paper, that the president's own government had contradicted the president's accusation. Let me explain what the numbers showed when the polling came in, because public opinion in the days following this exchange told a story that went well beyond partisan lines. Within 5 days of the exchange, surveys showed that 63% of Americans, including 41% of self-identified Republicans, rated Carney's response as effective or very effective. 57% said that the use of American government data specifically undermined the president's original accusation. And when asked directly who they found more credible in the exchange, 52% of all respondents chose the Canadian Prime Minister over their own president. Among independent voters, that number rose to 61%. Among voters under 35, it reached 68%. A generation that has grown up inside information overload, that has developed an acute ability to distinguish substance from noise, rendered its verdict. One man had looked certain, the other had sounded loud.
And the public, as the investor Warren Buffett has observed across 7 decades of watching how power actually operates in rooms, could tell the difference.
Buffett himself watched the clip and offered an analysis that has since been cited in business school curricula and political science departments at multiple universities. His observation was this: the person who uses the fewest words in any negotiation, in any boardroom, in any high-stakes conversation, is almost always the person with the most power. Talking is what people do when they are uncertain. Brevity is what people do when they know. A confident position does not need 15 minutes. A confident position needs 30 seconds. And if 30 seconds is still too long, it needs one word. Carney needed one word: mirror. The President of the United States needed hundreds of words and 5 repetitions of the same crude accusation. The length of each response told every observer everything they needed to know about the relative strength of each position. Let me explain why this exchange is being studied beyond the immediate political context. Because the international community's response to what happened here goes beyond the specific trade dispute that triggered it. Within 1 week of the exchange, 2 allied foreign ministries had formally requested briefings from Ottawa. Not about the substance of the trade figures, not about the policy positions underlying the bilateral tension, but about the communication strategy itself. How do you prepare a 30-second response? How do you identify the single document that proves your case? How do you construct a binary argument with no escape? How do you select the one word that redirects without counterattacking?
The 30 seconds were being analyzed not as a political moment confined to a specific news cycle, but as a methodology, a replicable framework for responding to public attacks from larger powers, applicable across any bilateral relationship in which a smaller party faces a disproportionate accusation from a more powerful one.
One European diplomat told a major financial newspaper that Canada had just written the manual, and the manual was 30 seconds long. A professor of political communication at the London School of Economics announced that the clip would be added to a graduate curriculum as the definitive case study in minimum word, maximum impact public communication. The first time a diplomatic exchange had been added to that program's syllabus in its 30-year history. The reason it was selected was not because of who the participants were or because of the geopolitical stakes of the Canada-US trade relationship. It was selected because of its structural purity. Because the 30 seconds demonstrated, with a clarity that required no annotation, the single most important principle in high-stakes communication. The argument that does not need to argue is the argument that is already won. And here is the principle that gives the entire exchange its deepest significance, the one that extends far beyond a trade dispute and far beyond these two leaders and this particular political moment. The president deployed the crudest word in political language, liar, expecting it to land with the force of a weapon. In the short-term logic of political combat, the calculation was straightforward. If the accusation is damaging enough, the accused must spend their energy defending themselves, and the time spent defending is time not spent attacking. The accused is placed on the back foot. The accuser controls the terrain. That is the theory. What Carney's 30 seconds demonstrated is why the theory fails in the presence of a specific and verifiable counter-condition. When the accusation is not only false, but provably false, using the accuser's own evidence. Under those conditions, the accusation does not place the accused on the back foot.
It hands the accused a weapon, and the only question is whether the accused is disciplined enough to use it with precision rather than volume.
Carney was disciplined enough. He resisted the 15-minute rebuttal. He resisted the press conference with charts. He resisted the expert panel. He resisted every instrument of modern political communication that would have done what political communication almost always does: generate more words, more noise, more content for a cycle that was already saturated. He understood that the most powerful move available to him was to say less, to say precisely enough, to say it once, clearly, and then leave the room. And that is precisely what the White House still cannot answer. Not because the administration lacks the resources to mount a response, not because the communications infrastructure of the most powerful government on earth is insufficient to the task, but because the specific structure of Carney's 30 seconds made a complete response logically impossible. You cannot dispute data produced by your own government without creating a more damaging story than the one you are trying to contain. You cannot ignore a binary that the public has already absorbed and already answered in their own minds. You cannot outbrief a 30-second clip with a 20-minute press conference, because the disparity in length becomes its own editorial comment on the relative confidence of each position. The word mirror remains unanswered. Not because no one in Washington has tried to answer it, but because answering it requires acknowledging what the question contains. That the accusation, delivered 5 times at the White House podium, described not the man it was aimed at, but the man who aimed it. And that is the final frame of this story, the one that extends furthest beyond the specific personalities and the specific trade figures and the specific political moment in which it occurred.
What the 30 seconds actually revealed is something about the nature of power in an era of unprecedented informational noise. For decades, political communication has operated on the assumption that volume is authority, that the loudest voice, the most repeated claim, the most comprehensive press conference, the most fully staffed rebuttal operation is the most powerful. The assumption has been that winning a public argument means producing more content, more evidence, more surrogates, more presence in every available medium. Carney's 30 seconds did not merely challenge that assumption. They falsified it in real time, in front of every newsroom on Earth, with one page of data and one word. The quietest voice in that exchange belonged to the man who had been called a liar 5 times. The most powerful argument was the one that took the least time to make. The most devastating response was the one that did not respond at all, in the conventional sense, that did not rebut, did not argue, did not defend, but simply held up a mirror and said, "Look at what you are describing, because what you are describing is yourself."
In a world that has spent years drowning in the escalating volume of political language, in the permanent acceleration of the news cycle, in the assumption that whoever speaks longest and loudest must have the most to say, a man stood at a podium for 30 seconds with one piece of paper and 5 words and proved the opposite. He proved that the strongest position requires the fewest words to state. He proved that the most credible voice is the one that knows precisely when to stop. He proved that when the facts are unambiguous, the argument is already made before the first word is spoken. And he proved that the most powerful thing any communicator can say is often not what they choose to include, but everything they choose to leave out. The word is mirror. Washington has not answered it. The silence is the answer.